Meg, there are dragons in the twins' vegetable garden.
Meg Murray took her head out of the refrigerator, where she had been foraging for an after-school snack, and looked at her 6-year-old brother, Charles Wallace Murray. It did not do to answer Charles Wallace too quickly when he said something odd. She noticed the fresh rips in the knees of his blue jeans, a darkening bruise on the cheekbone under his left eye.
Meg, did you hear me? There are dragons in the twins' vegetable garden. Or there were. They've moved to the north pasture now.
Yes, I heard you. Where did the big boys jump you this time? In the schoolyard or when you got off the bus?
You aren't listening to me.
I happen to care that you've been in school for 2 months now, and not a single week has gone by that you haven't been roughed up. Maybe that explains why you're talking about dragons.
I didn't see the dragons till I got home. Come on, I'll show you.
As they crossed the lawn and headed for the north pasture, Meg noticed that Charles Wallace was breathing heavily, as if he had been running, though they had not been walking rapidly.
Charles, are you all right?
I've been sort of tired all autumn, but it's been worse this week and much worse today than it was yesterday. Mother thinks it's more than the bigger boys punching me.
Meg felt her hands go cold with panic. She had blamed Charles Wallace's paleness and lethargy on his problems at school, but now it seemed it was more than that, and even their mother was worried. They climbed a low stone wall and looked across the pasture.
They're gone! My dragons are gone!
Are you sure it wasn't just the rocks or shadows or something?
Meg, they were right by the rocks, all sort of clustered together. It looked like hundreds of wings and eyes opening and shutting between the wings, and some smoke and little spurts of fire.
Did you go close?
It didn't seem wise. I stayed here and watched for a long time. Then I went home to wait for you. Meg, you don't believe me.
But in a strange way, Meg did believe him. Not perhaps that he had seen actual dragons, but Charles had never before tended to mix fact and fancy. Her anxiety about him deepened.
If Mother is really worried about your health, why doesn't she have a doctor look at you?
She has. Before you got home from school, Dr. Louise went over me from top to toe.
What did she say?
Nothing much. But whatever is wrong has to do with mitochondria and faranduli.
Meg hunched her shoulders. Mitochondria and faranduli. Talking about them was what had gotten Charles Wallace into trouble his very first day in school, when each child had been asked to tell something about themselves.
What was that, Charles? The mighty what?
I'm interested in mitochondria. They and the faranduli come from the prokaryocytes.
The what?
Well, billions of years ago, they probably swam into what eventually became our eukaryotic cells. They have their own DNA and RNA, which means they're quite separate from us. They have a symbiotic relationship with us, and the amazing thing is that we're completely dependent on them for our oxygen.
Now, Charles, suppose you stop making silly things up, and the next time I call on you, don't try to show off.
That was the beginning of the trouble. Each week, Charles Wallace had had some trouble with the bigger boys in school. Each week, he came home with some kind of bruise. So Meg had decided to go see the principal of the grade school, Mr. Jenkins. She didn't like Mr. Jenkins. She'd had trouble of her own with him when he was the principal of the regional high school she went to, and he didn't seem to have changed.
I don't appreciate your interference, Margaret.
But the bigger boys are bullying Charles Wallace.
If anybody wishes to discuss the situation with me, I think it should be your parents.
Please, Mr. Jenkins. I know people have thought Charles Wallace isn't very bright, but he's really...
We've run IQ tests on all the first graders. Now, your little brother's IQ is quite satisfactory.
You know it's more than that, Mr. Jenkins. His IQ is so high, it's untestable by normal standards.
If he's so bright, I wonder why your parents bothered to send him to school at all.
If there weren't a law about it, they probably wouldn't.
Now Meg sat down on the stone wall next to Charles Wallace, first carefully checking the rocks. A large, gentle, and completely harmless black snake lived in the wall, a special pet of Meg's twin brothers, Sandy and Dennis. The Murray children had watched her grow from a snakelet to her present flourishing size. She was named after Dr. Louise. Meg, although not actively afraid of her, was always careful to look for Louise before she sat. Louise was nowhere to be seen, so Meg relaxed and turned her attention again to Charles.
Why do people always mistrust people who are different? Am I really that different, Meg?
You're a lot brighter than the twins, but the twins are far from dumb. How do they manage?
I wish they'd tell me.
They don't talk at school the way they do at home, for one thing.
I thought if I was interested in mitochondria and faranduli, other people would be too. You know, Meg, the incredible thing about faranduli is their size. They're so small that all anyone can do is postulate them. Did you know Mother's working on them? If she really proves their existence, she'll probably get the Nobel Prize.
Why are faranduli so important?
The mitochondria I mentioned, they're tiny little organisms living in our cells. And faranduli live in a mitochondrion sort of the same way a mitochondrion lives in a human cell. And if anything happens to the faranduli, the mitochondrion gets sick and probably dies. So you see, if something happens to the faranduli, it would be disastrous.
Meg shivered, suddenly cold.
Why are you going on so about mitochondria and faranduli?
Meg, the reason Mother's been working in her lab day and night trying to find the effect of faranduli on mitochondria is that she thinks there's something wrong with my mitochondria.
What?
If my mitochondria get sick, then so do I.
How serious is it? Can Mother give you something for it?
I don't know. She won't talk to me. I'm only guessing. Hey, look at Louise.
Meg turned, following his gaze. Louise was slithering along the stones of the wall towards them, moving rapidly, sinuously, her black curves shimmering purple and silver in the autumn light.
Charles, run! She's going to attack!
She won't hurt us.
Louise stopped her advance just a few feet from Charles Wallace and raised herself up.
There's someone near. Someone Louise knows.
The dragons?
I don't know. I can't see. Look!
Their dog, Fortinbras, came galloping across the pasture. He jumped the wall and ran into the north pasture. Charles Wallace, panting with effort, followed him.
He's going to where my dragons were. Come on, Meg.
Meg hurried after. On the moss around a rock in the pasture, they found a small drift of feathers. They were soft and sparkling, and between the feathers were bits of glinting silver-gold scales, which might well belong to dragons.
You see, Meg, they were here. My dragons were here.
That evening, Meg, Charles Wallace, Sandy and Dennis, and Mrs. Murray had just sat down to dinner when Mr. Murray phoned from Washington to tell them that he was going from there to Brookhaven Laboratory for a week. Such trips were not unusual for either of their scientist parents, but Dennis asked,
Did Father tell you why he has to go rushing off to Brookhaven? Or is it another one of those top-secret classified things?
It's not really secret. There have been several bits about it in the papers recently.
About what?
Well, Sandy, the easiest way to explain it is that our new sonic instruments have picked up strange sounds. Sounds which aren't on any normal register, but much higher. After such a sound, a cosmic scream, some call it rather sensationally, there appears to be a small rip in the galaxy. Several stars have vanished completely. Where the stars were, there is nothing.
But things can't just vanish. We had it in school, the balance of matter.
It seems to be getting unbalanced.
You mean like the ecology?
No, Dennis. I mean that matter actually seems to be being annihilated.
Nothingness? That's impossible.
Meg looked down at the remains of her dinner. Dragons and rips in the sky. Charles Wallace, pale and listless. She did not like any of it. When she had finished the dinner dishes and her homework, she took a big flashlight from the pantry and ran out of the house and across the lawn.
At the stone wall, she lingered, not at all anxious to cross into the pasture.
Suddenly, she saw a shadow move on the wall, and she jumped back.
Louise!
Meg's heart was thumping, although Louise was not threatening. At least, Louise was not threatening her. But Louise was waiting, and there was no welcome in the waiting. Meg was watching in fascination as the head of the snake slowly weaved back and forth. when a voice from behind her made her whirl around.
Margaret,
Mr. Jenkins, what are you doing here?
your little brother thought I might find you here, Margaret. I feel I owe you an apology for my sharpness with you last week when you came to see me about Charles.
Mr. Jenkins held out a hand. In utter confusion, Meg reached out to take it, and as she did so, Louise rose up on the wall behind her, hissing and making a strange, warning clacking. Meg turned to see the snake raising her dark coil to strike at Mr. Jenkins.
Mr. Jenkins screamed in a way that Meg had never known a man could scream, a high, piercing screech. Then he rose up into the night like a great flapping bird, flew screaming across the sky, became a rent, an emptiness, a slash of nothingness.
Gone! He's gone! There's no one there! There's no thing there!
Suddenly, a tall, familiar shape hurtled toward her.
Meg! Meg, what is it?
Calvin! Calvin!
Calvin O'Keefe, her best friend, shook her urgently.
Meg, what's the matter? What happened?
Meg was still trembling violently, her heart racing. But she told Calvin about Mr. Jenkins, and then about Louise that afternoon, and about Charles Wallace and his dragons. She led him to the rock in the north pasture. Calvin took the flashlight from her. The beam came to rest in a small circle, and in the center of the circle shone something gold and glittering.
Okay, this is most peculiar. But what left it? After all, a gang of dragons just doesn't disappear. Did you tell your mother?
Mother's got enough worries. Let's wait till the dragons come back.
Charles, why aren't you in bed? Does Mother know you're out?
Who's here?
Meg and me. And you.
There's somebody else. Near my dragons.
Calvin and Meg turned around, and they saw wings. It seemed like hundreds of wings, spreading, folding, stretching. Meg had the feeling that she never saw all of it at once. Eyes. Merry eyes, wise eyes, ferocious eyes, opening and closing, looking at her. And wings in constant motion, covering and uncovering the eyes. Little spurts of flame and smoke spouted up between the wings. Suddenly, a voice called to them.
Do not be afraid. He won't hurt you.
A huge, dark form strode swiftly into the pasture, reached them in a few strides, and then stood very still. There was something in the quiet of his body, the repose of his voice, that drove away fear.
Who are you?
You may address me as Blodgeny. I am a teacher.
And my dragons?
His name is Progonoskis.
He's not dragons?
He is a cherubim.
He's a cherubim?
Flame spurted in indignation at the doubt in the atmosphere. When the wild things spoke, it was not in vocal words, but directly into their minds.
I suppose you think I ought to be a golden-haired baby face with no body and two useless little wings.
But, cherubim is plural.
I am practically plural. I am certainly not a cherub. I am a singular cherubim. And don't get any ideas about calling me Cherry or Cheery or Bimmy.
All right then, my children. Are you ready to start? We will call it, for want of a better word in your language, school. I came to call all three of you.
Where is your school?
Here, there, everywhere. In the schoolyard during first grade recess, with the cherubim and seraphim, among the farandulae.
But why all three of us? It's Charles who's the trouble. Ordinary school is just not going to work out for him.
Charles Wallace will have to learn to defend himself. I have come not so much to offer you my help as to ask for yours.
I'm not much of a help to anybody right now. It isn't just that I'm not getting along at school.
Yes, I know of the other problem. Nevertheless, you are called, and anybody who is invited to study with one of the teachers is called because he is needed. We must find out what is making you ill and, if possible, make you well again.
Oh, please, please, Blodgeny, can you help?
I think, my child, that it is you who must help, and Calvin, too. You will learn how as the lessons progress. Meanwhile, I will give each of you assignments. Charles Wallace, can you guess what yours is?
To learn to adapt?
Yes. To learn to adapt while remaining wholly yourself. Meg, you must pass 3 tests or trials. You must start immediately on the first.
What is it?
Part of the trial is that you must discover for yourself what it is. Prognoskes is to work with you. Together you must pass the tests. Now you will all go to school as usual in the morning.
But Blodgeny, I can hardly take a cherubim to school with me.
Prognoskes is not always visible, you know, Meg. Calvin, your work will be difficult and dangerous, but I cannot tell you yet what it is. Now, let us go.
When they reached the stone wall, the dark shadow of Louise rose up. Blodgeny bowed to the snake. Louise most definitely returned the bow.
Louise is a colleague of mine. She is a teacher. I will say good night to you now, my children.
Meg woke up before dawn, suddenly and completely, as though something had jerked her out of sleep. And then she remembered.
It must have been a dream. Obviously, it must all have been a dream.
She dressed hurriedly and went out in the still, chill pre-dawn to the north pasture. There was nothing there except the mist whirling gently in the faint breeze. Then the mist seemed to solidify.
Thank you for being prompt. It is in the nature of cherubim to dislike tardiness.
You're real, Progo. You're not something I dreamed. What do we do now?
We have to find out what our first ordeal is.
How do we find out?
If you've been assigned to me, I suppose you must be some kind of a namer too, even if a primitive one.
What does that mean? What does a namer do?
The last time I was with a teacher, my assignment was to memorize all the names of all the stars. Part of the purpose was to help each one to be more particularly the particular star it was supposed to be. That's what a namer's job is, basically. If your name isn't known, it's a very lonely feeling. So maybe you're supposed to make Earthlings feel more human.
What's that supposed to mean?
How do I make you feel?
Confused.
Who makes you least confused?
Calvin. When I'm with Calvin, I don't mind being me.
You mean he makes you more you, don't you? Who makes you feel the least you?
Mr. Jenkins. Progo, something happened last night, before we met you and Blodgeny.
As Meg tried to explain Mr. Jenkins' disappearance, she could sense Prognoskes pulling away. Suddenly, he flung all his wings about himself in a frantic reflex of self-preservation. Then 2 eyes looked out at her, and he uttered one word.
Ecthroi.
What did you say?
I think you have seen an Ecthros. And if we are dealing with Ecthroi, then we have to go see this Mr. Jenkins. It must be part of the trial.
But what is an Ecthros?
Come, littling. I'll take you someplace yesterday and show you.
How can you take me yesterday?
It's time for you to go into breakfast, so I can't possibly take you today, silly. Come.
Meg found herself looking directly into one of Progo's eyes, a great amber cat's eye. The dark mandala of the pupil opening, compelling, beckoning. She was drawn towards the oval, was pulled into it, was through it. She felt a flaming wind and a great shove, and she was standing on a bare stone mountaintop with Prognoskes blinking and winking at her. The cherubim raised a great wing to sketch the slow curve of the sky above them. In the sky were stars in totally unfamiliar constellations.
Where are we?
Never mind. Watch.
There came a sound which made Meg press her hands in pain against her ears. And across the sky, a crack, shivered, slivered, became a line of nothingness.
Progo! What is it? What happened?
The Ecthroi have exed. annihilated, negated, extinguished.